Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Intellectual Forum event. It's great to have you all with us. My name's Julian Huppert. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College. We will be recording this event for anybody who can't be with us. And now, normally I'd love to welcome you to our historic buildings. You can see some of them behind me, and our state-of-the-art lecture hall, which is just wonderfully technologically enabled. I would tell you stories about the college and its history and what we're doing now. But this term, we're having to do everything virtually for fairly obvious reasons. Now, that does have the advantage that you can join in for the comfort of your own homes using the wonders of technology, the theme of our discussion tonight. But I do hope you'll be back in person to see what the college is like, what the facilities are like, and to actually see that all of us do have at least a third dimension to ourselves. Now, we do lots of different events. We're an interdisciplinary centre that focuses on convening. And we have lots of other events coming up online this term. So on Wednesday, we have Mo Gaudat, who is Chief Business Officer at SpaceX, who'll be talking about happiness and how to find silver linings in a crisis. On the 4th of November, we'll be talking about whether seeing is believing and what that really means when we do scientific experiments like astronomy. What are we actually seeing and what do we learn? On the 11th, we're hearing from neurodiversity spokesperson Temple Grandin, and there's much more to come this term. So do look us up on Eventbrite, on Facebook, Twitter, sign up to our mailing list, keep up with everything that's on offer from us, and we hope to see you those. But today we're going to be talking about technology and the impact that it's having on how we work, think and feel. And obviously the last 6 months would have been very different if we didn't have the sort of technology facilities that we have now. This is the first, possibly the first techno pandemic that we've had to deal with. And we have an all-star panel coming to talk about every aspect of this. So we're going to hear from each of them in turn, and then there will be time for discussion and questions from all of you. So if you do have questions, please use the Q&A panel that you should be able to see in the Zoom controls so that we can manage all the questions, and I will put them to the panel. So our wonderful panel is Dex Hunter-Torek. Dex has been a speechwriter for luminaries from the tech world like Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, Elon Musk, and is now Director of Communications for the new Facebook Oversight Board. Anu Hatalampi is the first ever head of social media and AV at the University of Cambridge, managing channels with a combined followership of 4 million people. Not all of those 4 million have signed on tonight, but a good fraction. David Stilwell is the Academic Director of the Psychometric Centre here at Cambridge, a lecturer at the Judge Business School, works on big data and behaviour and what we can learn from those links. And lastly, we have our own Tyler Shores, who's actually just been promoted and is now a Senior Research Associate at the Jesus College Intellectual Forum. We work with Tyler quite regularly, and he's also ThinkLab Programme Manager for the University of Cambridge. So it's wonderful to have the four of you with us. Anu, I was wondering if you could start us off.
Sure, thank you. So, sit back everyone, we're going to start with a little time travel game, and you're going to have opportunity to score points as we go along. So, you ready? Here we go. It's January, and you've just made a New Year's resolution to go on a digital and social media detox, because you've heard so much about the negative impacts of social media, not just for your mental health, but also for your focus and for your use of time. You're also worried about your personal data and privacy. So you're thinking about closing your Facebook account because you've seen several acquaintances and friends close theirs. You've also recently read a blog post from a Cambridge academic explaining why they left Twitter, and you're considering leaving Twitter as well. Now it's time for your first point opportunity. If your New Year's resolution did indeed include a digital or social media detox, tell us in the chat and you score 1 point. Fast forward, it's the 15th of March. No one really knows what on earth is happening, and you're feeling a growing need to find out. You really want information. Your determination to stay on that digital detox is starting to crack. Well, you hadn't left Twitter just yet, so you've seen that there were already 2 million tweets about COVID-19. Your other social media channels are also starting to fill up with photos of empty supermarket shelves. To cheer yourself up, you order a pair of toilet roll inspired novelty earrings and go into lockdown. Another point scoring opportunity. If you shopped online for anything you would normally not buy, in these past 6 months, tell us what you bought in the chat and you get a point. A few weeks have passed now. April is here with its sunshine, and so are the roaring 20s. Your calendar is filling up fast with Zoom parties, bingo, quiz nights, live gigs on Facebook, national theatre performances on YouTube, and all those group calls with school friends, ex-partners, random people you hadn't spoken to in months or even years. Your digital detox is long gone now. Social media is your social life. To keep flourishing in lockdown, we've all been told to learn a new language, to learn to play an instrument, or maybe write our memoirs. I've done all those things. Our living rooms and kitchens are now not just our living rooms and kitchens, they are our office, yoga studio, school, bakery, barbershop, gym, cinema, and dance floor. In-car listening to radio, music, and podcasts has gone down by 50% because nobody's driving anywhere anymore. Instead, we're all working in our backyards, in our gardens, and in addition to the birdsong, we can now hear this constant buzzing and pinging of all the notifications from the apps we've downloaded. There's Messenger, WhatsApp, Telegram, Instagram, Teams, Skype, email. Viewership of videos related to sourdough is rising by 400%. And every time the weekend comes, barbecue is trending both on Facebook and Instagram. Tell us in the chat if you learned a language, if you learned to play an instrument, or if you got started on writing a book, and you get 1 point for each. So we jump ahead in time again, landing in July. And the UK is continuing to come out of lockdown and things are looking promising. They certainly look great for social media channels. Facebook now has 50 million more daily users across the globe. Twitter's daily usage has gone up by 34% compared to the year before. WhatsApp reports 2 billion monthly users, making it the biggest messaging platform on the planet. Gaming, listening to music on YouTube, and watching on-demand video services is up by 71% in the UK compared to 2019. And even though podcast listening did take a dip with commuters now working from home, absolutely everyone seems to have launched a podcast in lockdown. If you too have launched a podcast, tell us in the chat what's the name of your podcast, what's the topic of your podcast, and you score 1 point. And so we whiz through time again, and here we are safely back in October. According to Emojipedia, the use of positive happy smileys is on the decrease and has gone down by 6%, while the emoji with the pleading eyes, the big eyes, is surging in popularity. Instagram feeds are starting to fill up with nostalgic throwback photos from holidays to warm places we were able to do last year. The Cambridge academic is still not back on Twitter, but they've opened commenting on their blog because they want to get some interaction. By now, the rest of us are either used to or completely exhausted with all the text-based interaction and trying to keep up with the tens and hundreds of parallel conversations that we've started in these past 6 months. Luckily, Facebook is making things a little bit easier for us by connecting Messenger and Instagram direct messaging, with WhatsApp possibly waiting in the wings to be added. Spotify is launching a shows with music, a new format that combines music with talk content. And audio tweets are coming. Speaking is just less faff than all that typing. Drop a message in the chat if you've used the pleading big eye faced emoji in the recent times, and you can grab your final point. That's the end of our time travel game. Tell us what your final score was. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm slightly disturbed from the chat how many people are learning Finnish at the moment. I mean, I don't know what that says about the audience or about you or something. It was clearly a much more popular language than it used to be. Tyler, we've had a quiz. Let's hear from you.
Great. Yeah, I thought that was fun. I was just about to grab my point, but I'll let other people play too. So yeah, I thought just for fun, since we had a few minutes, we're physically in the Jesus College Intellectual Forum. So on Twitter, for people that are following along online or watching this later for recording, I stopped in the room, the Frank Hall, where we normally would be doing this. And it was weirdly poignant, actually, to see as like, all right, 3 months, sorry, back in March, we were planning to all be in this and to, host however many of you we could fit in there. So the tweet I sent was just like, it helps you visualize like, what it would normally be like. But yeah, I guess I would give a slightly different perspective on some of these things too, in that there's a lot of it's wonderful on the one hand that we can be socially distant as part of the lockdown and pandemic required things, but also still social. The fact that we are connected in this way, and the fact that we get to still talk and connect with all of you from different parts of the world, and all of this is actually a wonderful thing. So that's been something Anu touched upon, of course, already in terms of how this is before with the screen time debate has just totally done a 180. In terms of, and this is what some of my research has been in terms of there was a deluge of articles beginning of this year, last year, of course, with like, is screen time bad for us? Is it bad for our kids? Is it bad for democracy, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's become our lifeline to the rest of the world, meaning our devices and our screens. And I thought I would suggest also that there is this kind of like, our devices do everything now, right? And problematically, that means that we do everything on our devices. Like we do our work, we do our socializing, we do our our leisure time, we do our worrying or whatever it is that we do to like get information from the rest of the world. It can be hard to disentangle some of these things that it's happened quickly. Like it's really happened quickly for all of us. We are in a kind of a strange way part of this giant social experiment in terms of like what happens, what's different when we've moved everything so dramatically and so quickly online. I thought of an event like this, one of the helpful things is that these are opportunities for us to kind of like pause just a little bit for all of us that are here and listening to this and kind of think about our relationship with technology. We've been doing this long enough that we have some habits that we've kind of adopted in these sort of things. And the title of our talk is How is Tech Changing How We Work, Think, and Feel? And the other thing to keep in mind is also that we can change some of how tech is in turn changing how we work, think, and feel, and how we live. So I thought just very briefly, I'd give some kind of like, background kind of stuff for us to think about. And I'd love to hear more about this in the chats and these sort of things is what are like rethinking some of, what could we, or what would we want to change about our relationship with our screens and our devices and these sort of things. Speaking totally just like as a personal anecdote for me, I've developed morning quiet time, which was a habit that was really hard to establish. I actually had to resort to taping something over my screen at night so I wouldn't pick it up. But the idea behind that was first thing in the morning, the research that I've done, I would say about 9 out of 10 people, first thing in the morning, the very first thing they do in the morning, pick up the device if it's near the bedside and all of these things. Let me just check Twitter, let me check the news, let me check these sort of things. I decided I needed some quiet time. I needed some time to actually wake up first, drink coffee, and then feel like I could be ready to process all of these things. To me, that made a big difference. That was a conscious change on my part. I guess that's another way of saying is like thinking about our screen time. I'm not even so interested nowadays in reducing our screen time and thinking of all of these things, just like slight tweaks to our habits here and there. And I'm curious if anyone else has done something similar, but scheduling more time for digital breaks. Because we are spending all the time online now, like some things maybe we want to be able to give ourselves a break every once in a while. So whether that is using Google's digital well-being on the Android devices or Apple Screen Time or apps, like building in some digital quiet time so we can actually move around and engage and these sort of things. The one thing I want to mention too is, so my research is in digital distractions. Some of you might have seen the Social Dilemma documentary that came out recently on Netflix. A lot of stuff in there. Don't have time to talk about all of it, but some of the stuff on user experience and user design I think is really interesting. For example, infinite scroll is a big one for me in the stuff that I talk about. So infinite scroll, if you've ever used Instagram or Twitter or TikTok or any of these things, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the, kind of like scroll, 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 and intermittent reinforcement, boring stuff, interesting thing. And then you kind of keep doing that for a very long time. I'm wondering more about that now in terms of like, what is that doing for our kind of like overall sense of well-being, because we tend to zone out a little bit on some of these things. And all I'm saying is like, these are just suggestions. I'm not necessarily like, in a position to make rules in these things. I'm just a guy on the internet to most of you, but like, think about it. Just think in terms of how does it make you feel sometimes? Like the next time you pick up your digital device, your screen, your phone or your tablet or these sort of things, why am I looking at this now? Is there something I need to check? Is it a way to kind of like deal with something else or not deal with something else I don't want to do? Is it out of boredom? Is it out of habit? Do I not know why I'm picking up my screen right now or looking at these sort of things? So I mentioned that this is something to think about. Hopefully we get to talk about it more in the comments. And one last thing, and I'll let other panelists chime in too, is that a lot of us have talked about this. Zoom fatigue has certainly become a thing, and that is a real phenomenon for almost all of us, because we have to be on, what do we look like on camera, even though I shouldn't be looking at myself right now, but all of these things, we're hyper conscious of our like sense of presentation and all of that, and it is tiring. So the point is, I guess I'm trying to say is like, we have to remember to give ourselves breaks with some of these things, being mindful of like, how much time am I spending on this? How does this make me feel? How does this influence the rest of my life? So I'll leave it as that, as kind of like open questions. And I think I'll hand it back over to Julian.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tyler. And I mean, I certainly find I crave seeing people for real, partly just for resting the eyes. And actually I found myself sort of also trying to have phone calls rather than anything visual, just so I can make it sound only and get on with something else, which I never thought I would say. Anyway, well, thank you very much, Tyler. Dex, over to you. Lovely to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Julian. Well, I thought it was amazing that Julian mentioned Zoom fatigue, and I was restraining myself from chuckling there, just because we're all the folks hanging out on Zoom at 7:45 in the evening on a Saturday. We are our own worst enemies here. But it's great to be here. I do think we're all going to end up talking about COVID. So I'll continue the trend of starting by talking about COVID. I think this has been an amazing microcosm of the impact of technology, both good and bad, on our lives. And if you think about just the experience of the last year, it's absolutely unthinkable to see how this sort of played out without access to many of the tools that we all take for granted now. It was access to the internet that really allowed word to spread so quickly around the world, at the beginning of the year. It was critical having access to that information that allowed societies all over the world to mobilize just to begin putting in place the things they needed to do to survive, just the last year. We all know, of course, from our own personal experience, just how essential technology has been to keeping all of us connected with the people we care about, to do our jobs, to stay in touch with our communities. I started a new job in May. I'm now at the Oversight Board, and the Oversight Board is a brand new organization. I was the 4th employee there. I have met one of my co-workers. I have not met any of the team that I've hired. Absolutely crazy thing. That would never have happened, in any previous time. All the folks I interviewed all over the world, are people I, talk to through a webcam sitting at my desk here in the UK. And, we have a functioning organization now, which has never met in person for the most part. And that's something, again, I think we take for granted, but is actually extraordinary, and is just a sign of how technology has made our societies more resilient and prepared to navigate these extraordinary moments. You think about how all the scientists around the world who are part of this massive global effort going on right now to try and get a vaccine for COVID, they've all been working collaboratively. They've all been doing research together, driven by the internet. And so ultimately, the key to defeating COVID lies in some of those tools that are available to us. And I think one last thing I'd say on that is technology has also been critical in allowing us to hold decision makers to account during COVID. And there have been leaders in government and in industry and in society who have had to be scrutinized extraordinarily carefully during this crisis. And many of the decisions they've made have not always been the right ones. And I think one of the big differences between this moment and this global health crisis and previous generations is just that those decisions can be scrutinized so carefully in real time as they happen. This is a crisis that's going on day after day, and we can see and interpret and analyze and debate and challenge all of those moves as they're taking place by the decision makers. Now, here's the thing, those are all great things, but at the same time, we've also seen the flip side of technology. We've seen the impact of disinformation and just that avalanche of fake news and rumors and conspiracies that have been allowed to spread. Think how Bill Gates is reacting to this, learning every day from social media that he's got a nefarious scheme to control all of our brains with 5G and implanting microchips. This is the sort of thing that has become just part of the daily background noise of social media in the year 2020. You think about the culture wars that are going on, and of course those conspiracies and 5G conspiracies, that's part of it. There is a culture war that's playing out online today, and technology has been key to allowing some of these movements to grow and become these huge forces in societies all over the world, and to internationalize some of these forces. And we do often, in the tech industry, like to talk about how amazing and enlightening all these tools are, as if when we have access to all these technologies, we are going to learn a new language, we are going to go write our memoirs, we are going to go and do something enriching. I don't know about you, but I think that I've spent the last year watching the entirety of Netflix. I think I may have actually reached the end of Netflix and watched everything on there. And so, although technology has been an absolute lifeline, during COVID, it's also in many cases been this amazing security blanket. I probably could have gone and done something much more enriching in my little bit of free time, but instead it's so much easier to slob out on the couch and watch Stranger Things. So here's 3 thoughts based on just what this moment means. I think the first is, it's really, really difficult, if not impossible, to actually quantify the impact of technology on our daily lives. There's an ambitious topic that we've set for discussing tonight, and it's great that we dig into that, but we're not going to answer it tonight. We're not going to get to the end of it or anywhere near it. The impact of tech is so extraordinary. It impacts us in so many ways, seen and unseen. We can only ever scratch the surface of what it truly means. I think the second thing is, people often have a knee-jerk reaction against tech, because that's the way humans have always been. I also enjoy when Tyler was mentioning digital habits, because when I was a kid, I was an uber geek growing up. I think I'm still an uber geek. But growing up, my mom hated that I spent, as much of my free time as I could after school on the computer playing computer games with my friends. And she would say, you can have an hour of gaming maximum every night. She would set very tight limits on the amount of time I could spend on that newfangled computer. And of course, I like to remind her occasionally now and then that if it weren't for me finding all sorts of ingenious ways to evade her attempts to stop me using the computer, I probably would have never ended up working in Silicon Valley and having a career in tech. All the time I spent on that computer ended up being key to my career. I often do think, back to the historical fears of technology. If you went and got a medical encyclopedia, from some places in the 19th century, there was a thing called railway madness, because people were so concerned at this newfangled, railway technology. They thought that, going at speeds faster than 20 miles an hour would drive you mad. It would literally make you unhinged. In the 1500s, the Swiss scientist Konrad Gessner was arguing against the printing press, because he said that the abundance of literature would be disastrous for human culture and collaboration. He actually wanted to restrict our ability to print all those things. So I don't want to simplify it too much, because there are real fears and there are real problems with technology. But it's also, I think, a perennial human instinct to fear what's new, and to think that the previous generation and the previous way of life might have had something better than us that we may have lost in the present and the relentless march of modernity. And I would say two last points. One is, I think we often conflate societal problems with tech problems. Like, when you think about things like fake news, the conversation almost exclusively unfolds in forums like this with what have Facebook or Twitter or YouTube done or not done to stop that avalanche of fake news. Fake news is not a problem that was created by tech. I can assure you that humans have enjoyed sharing fake news for the entirety of human history. And I can also tell you that there's a reason why millions and millions of people in our societies all over the world are extraordinarily angry and willing to share and willing to believe the fake news that is online. There is a reason that our societies are racked by all sorts of enormous problems. And it is both in technology that I think we can see potential solutions, but also some of the sparks driving those fires. So it's not as simple as saying, tech should get a grip on these things. Why can't we tweak an algorithm to control fake news or hate speech or any of these things? If you are looking for an algorithmic solution at the end of the day to a societal problem, you are begging to be disappointed. And the last thing I would say is, we all take this stuff for granted. Here we are on a Saturday night, sharing a video conversation with brilliant people and a brilliant audience all over the world. That's not what most of the world is going through. The stats say that there's about 4 billion people online today and have access to the internet. Actually, the vast majority of those folks don't have an internet experience that's even like the one you and I have. They do not have unlimited super fast broadband. They do not have the latest smartphones filled with apps. They are really trying to get some limited connectivity experience, just to experience the limited benefits of the internet, things that you and I probably associate with 10 years ago online. And nearly half the world doesn't have any access to the internet. So there's billions more people still waiting to come online, still waiting to receive all the benefits of being connected. And I do think one thing that's often missing in these discussions is the reminder that the things that you and I take for granted and we can afford to be cynical about haven't even shown up for a lot of people. And I would also say a lot of folks who often are very critical of technology, they never ever want to actually give it up. And I think that says something about it. So I will close there, and I'm looking forward to the debate.
Thank you very much, Dex. So a huge richer zone. I made it 4 points rather than 3, but that may be my inability to count about where things are. And I think that idea that we have to tackle social problems as social problems rather than assuming there's a magic tech wand is an interesting one. But we might come back to some of that in the conversations. I think there's a number of threads there. And just to remind you, there is that opportunity to ask questions. Use the Q&A tab, which hopefully you've all managed to get onto. And we'll come on to those shortly after the next speaker. David, over to you.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks, everyone. So I've enjoyed this kind of broad discussion, and I'll enjoy the broad discussion afterwards. But I wanted to, in my 5-minute presentation, talk a little bit about quite a specific issue that it just happens to be related to my research. So one of my roles here in Cambridge is I'm academic director of the Psychometric Centre, and one of the pieces of research I've looked at is how well you can understand people from their big data, especially from social media data. So a specific issue I wanted to talk about was the company that kind of claims itself as the company that can influence how we think and feel, which is Cambridge Analytica. And the reason I bring it up now is because just a couple of weeks ago, the Information Commissioner in the UK, so the ICO, has finished its investigation into Cambridge Analytica, and they've published their sort of final report. They've talked to Parliament about their final questions, and it led to a few sort of interesting headlines that well, I'll read some of them. So one headline in FT was Cambridge Analytica probe finds no evidence it misused data to influence Brexit. Or New Statesman says the notion that the contentious British firm played a pivotal role in the Trump and Brexit votes has become ever harder to maintain. And it's kind of interesting for me because I think Cambridge Analytica has kind of followed this hype cycle. You know, the hype cycle of new tech where it starts off sort of down the bottom here and no one knows about it. And then suddenly everyone thinks this new tech, whether it's, big data or AI or whatever it is going to solve everything. And then you get this drop into the, trough of disillusionment where, it turns out we don't have self-driving cars, despite 10 years ago being promised we'd have them by now. And suddenly people are saying, well, AI is going to solve nothing at all. And then eventually it sort of evens out and you end up somewhere in the middle where, AI, machine learning, they have their role, big data has its role, blockchain has a role. And sort of, it's not going to solve everything. It's not completely useless, but it's somewhere in the middle. And I think it's a good allegory for Cambridge Analytica. So they really did kind of start out as being, this company, The Guardian, Carol Cadwallader published its whistleblower report with Chris Wiley saying, Cambridge Analytica has led to Trump, it's caused all the issues that we're in now. There's this great hack Netflix documentary with another whistleblower, Brittany Kaiser, where she's saying, all about what Cambridge Analytica did. So it met that peak of inflated expectations. And I think now we're in this trough of disillusionment where, now the headlines are, well, it turns out it didn't affect anything at all. So I just wanted to reflect on where I think we sort of got to and what I think we should take away from this whole episode on the basis of, the science about what they actually did and what the science says, what kind of effect it might have actually had. So just in terms of what tech they said that they had. So we published some research back in 2015 showing that if you've got someone's Facebook data, if you've got someone's Facebook likes specifically, you can predict this really personal stuff. So people's personality. And that's what Cambridge Analytica was saying. They were saying, we got big data and we can predict millions of people's personalities. So our research showed that you can do that quite effectively, probably about as good as another human can. So if you ask, my friends or my wife, is David an introvert or an extrovert, they'll make a prediction and their prediction will be about as good as the data prediction that you could get from, Twitter or Facebook or one of these big social media companies if you've got lots of data about someone. But then you get to the next stage, which is, well, okay, you can predict someone's personality, but can you change how they think and feel, right? So can you influence someone given that you've predicted their personality? And this is where it gets a bit trickier. So let me show if I can hopefully do this very fast. So hopefully you can see that this slide here, this shows when we did a little experiment to see if we could influence people. In this case, it was with a cosmetics company. And the goal was just, can we get people to, click on the advert and buy some cosmetics? So these are two adverts we came up with, and you can see one of them's aimed at extroverts and one's aimed at introverts. So on the basis that we can predict someone's personality, can we personalize an advert that will get them to be more likely to click and more likely to buy stuff? And this is what this kind of stuff looks like, right? Ultimately, when it comes down to it, it's a marketer sitting there and going, well, I'm selling to an extrovert. How can I do that in a way? How can I influence an extrovert in a way that's different to introverts? And these are the kinds of adverts we come up with, and we ran them on Facebook, and we looked at the number of clicks and purchases and all the rest of it. And we got about an 80%, so up to about 80% better return on investment when we personalized the adverts effectively than when we didn't. Okay, so, and I want to sort of emphasize this 80%. So it's not 1,000,000%, right? So it's not you personalize an advert to someone's personality and you can make them do anything. But it does sort of nudge things along a bit, and if you're spending millions of dollars on an ad campaign, then that is money worth having. So then let's look at Cambridge Analytica. So what were they doing in terms of politics? So I've got a few adverts that I've found from various news reports. So here's one of them that apparently they were running. So it's an advert that, Republican Party ran, and it was aimed at conscientious people. So these are people who follow the rules, they like things to be well-defined, they don't like to sort of be impulsive, they like to, perfectionist extremes. So this is the advert they came up with: look up marriage and get back to me. So it's on the topic of same-sex marriage, and they've got a picture of the Bible, a picture of the dictionary, and the point they're trying to make is, according to them, the dictionary defines marriage as, according to them, between man and a woman. The Bible says this about marriage, therefore case closed. And the idea is, if you're a very conscientious person, if you like to follow the rules, then the dictionary definition, or what the Bible says, is kind of meant to be very compelling for you. Now, what we don't know is how effective those adverts actually were. So all we can see is we can look at the adverts and sort of think, does that sound like it's effective? All we can say is, well, when we did it with cosmetics, it was, this 80% effective, but not 1,000,000%. Here's a couple more. So Second Amendment, so this is right to bear arms, so going around with guns. They've got one aimed at people high in neuroticism, so these are people who feel stress and anxiety. So you've got, have a gun, it's an insurance policy, so that's meant to influence people who get more anxious. The one aimed at agreeableness, so these are people who really care about, friends and family and loved ones. This is key for them. So it's all about, father-daughter kind of experience, firing a gun. This one on the right-hand side, apparently it's aimed at conscientious people. To be honest, I don't understand why it would work for conscientious people, but it kind of shows how experimental the stuff they were doing, right? So they were coming up with ideas on the fly. Okay, let me stop sharing the screen. So this is the kind of stuff they were doing. So I think when I show it to most people, it's kind of less surprising than you would think, right? So you hear about in the media, you've got this hype cycle, and, and it sounds incredible when you hear about psychological micro-targeting or whatever. But when you look at the adverts, it's perhaps less surprising than you might think. It is kind of a traditional marketer thinking about how to influence someone with this kind of psychology, in the same way that a marketer might think about, how can I influence women or mothers or fathers, or retired people. So what do I think we should take away from this whole process? So in my view, what Cambridge Analytica were doing, it wasn't kind of this complete revolution, but it was sort of an evolution, right? So it was kind of taking the next step of what marketers are doing already, what political marketers are doing already. So they had lots more, they had lots of data, perhaps a little bit more data than others, and they're analyzing it in a much more scientific way, perhaps, or a bit more scientific way. Using psychological theories rather than sort of marketers' intuition. So in my view, where we're at now is that I think all marketers, not just political, are going to be taking account, taking advantage of all this data of us that's available, right, through the social media that we're using to try and influence us. And ultimately, that was what Facebook ended up being fined for by the FTC. It wasn't for psychological micro-targeting; it was for not looking after its users' data. This $5 billion fine that they got. The other thing to take away, I think, is that marketers who do this stuff every day, they quite often think it's just normal, right? Like, this is not surprising. It's something that marketers always do. But I think when it gets into the public domain and people really know what's going on, what political and non-political marketers are doing, it's quite surprising just how much data and the ways they're analyzing it and what they can do with that. So I think there's going to be more of this in future. The people who work for Cambridge Analytica have gone on to work for other companies doing similar kind of stuff. It is kind of the next step. And I think we're left with kind of the key questions that almost we started with, but I think they're perhaps more clear now. So, what is the right amount of data to have out there about us? Both at, the individual level, so how much data do I feel comfortable with having out there? And societal level, like how much data should there be out there for the whole society? Who controls this data and is get made more powerful from it? And then finally, what kind of limits should we have on the way that the data is actually used? So even if it's out there, it doesn't mean it should be used for particular purposes. And I think there's still that debate to be had, and that, you know, Cambridge Analytica going away doesn't mean that these problems, you know, don't still need to be thought about and solved. All right, thanks.
Thank you very much, David. And some fascinating things there, and interesting to see some of those adverts and to think how we'd be influenced and what it says about whether technology can allow about human agency. At what point have we lost so much ability to decide for ourselves that there's a challenge? So we've had a few questions coming in, and I'll try and fit them in slightly thematically. But can I perhaps start with one that builds a bit on what David said and something that Dexter's been working on as well, which is about governance in this area. So we've talked about technology as a whole, but there are real issues about who gets to decide what the rules are with the new technology. We heard about the printing press, and we set up rules around that. We have a lot of rules around railways. I've been exploring this. I did some work as chairing an independent review panel for DeepMind Health, looking at AI and healthcare, what should and shouldn't be allowed. So what do each of you think we ought to be doing about governance in the tech sector? Is it just a sort of set of companies that we should leave alone to do things as long as they're not, you know, already illegal? Or are there things that we need to bring in to check monopoly power or other power? I'm happy with anybody who wants to pick up. I think Dex unmuted first. I don't know if that meant you wanted to go first, but.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, this question gets asked all the time. And for me, it's like, there's a really straightforward answer, which is, it turns out we need everybody to be part of this effort. It's not going to be a thing that the industry can do on its own or should be allowed to do on its own. And it's not a thing that government should do on its own, or, you know, should suddenly assume, you know, a decision-making authority over the rest of the industry. We need folks to collaborate here. You know, and so much of this conversation, you know, I think on both sides involves simply trying to shrug off you know, the other side, and to, you know, make out that the other side has no validity being part of these discussions. You know, for the industry, you know, a lot of folks, you know, think, oh, politicians are idiots and they just don't know anything about technology. And look, let's be clear, there's a lot of politicians who really don't know the technology and should, you know, learn a little bit more before they start, you know, opining on it. But certainly government and policymakers have to be a part of that process. We live in democratic societies, and we want, you know, our leaders to be able to shape the environment, especially on issues of this importance. On the other hand, you have politicians and critics of tech who make out that every Silicon Valley entrepreneur and innovator is some sort of mustache-twirling villain. You know, they're here to steal your data and, you know, sell it to some ad men. And, you know, it's simply ludicrous, you know, that we're in a position where some of the greatest job creators, you know, and folks who are creating inventions that we all depend on in our daily lives, you know, are in a position where they're all being made to look like villains. Now, you can absolutely say, hey, they've given plenty of ammunition to the critics. You know, there's a reason that lots of people think Silicon Valley has totally failed. But ultimately, if we want to have real solutions, we've got to be able to move past this, you know, name calling and simply thinking that we can, you know, pin all our hopes on one set of actors versus the other. That's not a realistic solution to any of these things without doing some pretty terrifying things involving vesting large amounts of power in other institutions. And I think all of us would really want to see a future where actually we can collaborate and you don't end up with just one set of actors, you know, dominating the debate.
Anyone else want to contribute on this? Tyler, I think you tried to unmute earlier.
Yeah, I was just, I think Dex brings up a really good point, well, a couple of good points, but the idea that we have to rely upon government or just solely on government or just solely on the tech companies to police themselves, I think does a disservice to all of us in the sense that like that's sort of ceding our own responsibility for some of these things. And I mean that in the most positive sense is that we do have more control than we think we do. Awareness is part of it in terms of like, all right, so we can understand that there is a lot of data and there are things, but we can kind of choose and like, you know, conversations like this and looking online and being able to kind of like be aware of like, all right, so what are the conversations happening right now that go beyond the superficial kind of like buzzwordy sort of things about this. I just leave that out there as kind of like a thing to be hopeful about and hopefully to realize. And it's like, yeah, it does take work on our part, like our part, all of us, our part to, do change some of these things for the better. And we still have a lot to do.
I know, David, do either of you want to?
Well, I'll just say, so I agree that like the more people who understand this and get involved, the better. I've just, the experience so far is not promising in my view. Individuals have been sort of worried about social media, I think, for a while. You get these campaigns, hashtag delete Facebook or, delete Twitter or, whatever it is. And it hasn't changed anything as far as I could see. Very little has changed. In terms of government, again, I come back to Cambridge Analytica, but it's just because I know about that. Plenty of governments brought in Facebook, or they tried to bring in, Mark Zuckerberg. So UK Parliament tried to bring in Zuckerberg, many, many times. And they even sort of joined together with a whole coalition of parliaments to try and bring them in, and wouldn't come. And I just, I'm pessimistic about the ability, even of, the UK's national government, to actually do much about this, or at least I haven't seen much evidence of it in the past. Journalists, I see lots of great journalism, but it sort of feels like a lot of these tech companies sort of treat it as a PR problem and not as a fundamental issue. Quite a lot of the time, a journalist writes about it, and the question is, well, how can you get better coverage? Not, is there a real problem that needs solving? So I don't see much evidence of these groups having much impact, or at least as much impact as I would like to see.
Anu, I think it's your chance, but can I also just throw in a question, and I'll come back to everyone else on this at the same time, from Finn Cormican. If you could each submit or remove one piece of legislation to improve our relationships with technology and tech companies, what would it be? So if you can sort of straddle the two questions, that would be wonderful.
I think my answer is kind of the same to both of those things, really. I mean, coming from Finland, where we've got an amazing public education system, and media literacy is part of the curriculum. I think at the present, it's like an optional thing for teachers to bring into the classrooms. But I certainly think that this would be one way, of educating people about how to read media. And recently, a couple of Cambridge academics were working on this game that's just been released called Go Viral, which helps us, learn how misinformation around COVID spreads and how it works, and gives the basic skills to spot that misinformation. So I think education will play a really important part in this. And coming back to Dex's point about the fact that there are still, so many people just joining these technologies. So if there is a way of starting somewhere with that basic media literacy, I think that could go a long way.
We might come back to education a bit later, and thanks, Tyler, for sharing the link to the game if anybody wants to play it after we've finished, of course. Anyone else have an idea on legislation before we move off this that we should introduce or get rid of? Dex, you seem to be.
Yeah, so I definitely think media literacy is by far the top one. If I was going to add another one, and this will be a legislative nightmare to construct, I think there needs to be some sort of impetus for the tech industry to embed diversity at its core. And diversity is a thing which, I spent most of my career in Silicon Valley. I have seen firsthand what a massive impact the lack of diversity has in producing some of the terrible outcomes that we see from tech companies. There were times often where I'd be in the room, at companies, I'd be the only European in the room. And, I'd be the only person from a minority background in the room. And, if I was the person, critiquing any of those moves, people would say, yeah, classic European, they've got problems with privacy. They're a doomsayer, they think everything, the sky is falling. And if anything, I think it was a sign that there's a set of folks who have dominated thinking in the tech industry for a very long time, who have had a completely Panglossian view of these problems that we have in our society. You know, one of the things that drove me bananas for years was the number of times people would invoke Steven Pinker in discussions. And if folks aren't familiar with Steven Pinker, he's a very popular thinker in Silicon Valley, you know, who has been saying for many, many years that actually, in spite of all the terrible things you read, life is generally getting better for most of the world, most of the time. You look at, you know, data like, you know, the number of people living in poverty, and you see people emerging from that. You look at economic growth, you look at rising literacy. Things are all great on an upward trend. And I would always have this, you know, furious debate with people, because I'd say, look, you're completely misunderstanding short-term trends for structural instability that is built into the global system. How fragile is our way of life? How inequitable, you know, how much anger and resentment and suffering is hidden in those statistics, not to mention ignoring little insignificant problems like climate change. And of course, you know, now we're in a world where many of those predictions, which were confidently made by Silicon Valley thinkers, you know, just, you know, 18 months ago, now look downright ludicrous in a world that's been ravaged by the economic and the social fallout of COVID. So if I could force tech companies to take diversity seriously, to not just hire loads of engineers, or to you know, make it so that, you know, everyone should be learning to code in our society, but actually make them hire some arts and humanities folks, to hire some social scientists, to actually hire some people who don't just live in the bubble and only experience of the Ivy Leagues, I think that would make a huge impact.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Tyler, David, who wants to pick up a different thing from what we've heard so far?
The legislative question, I'm still thinking about it. That's I feel like, you know, I don't have a lot of time to think about it, but like I'm going to cheat a little bit and expand and say, like, if I had to pick one, I pick the Patriot Act, which for non-American people was the one that was pushed through after 9/11. And God, now that I started to think about it, I was like, oh, I can't give a long-winded answer. It opened a huge Pandora's box in terms of mass surveillance and these sort of things that fundamentally changed the online data, whatever, like our data history and everything since then. Sorry, that's not quite addressing your question, but if I had to pick one, I'd pick that one, because I was like, huh, a lot of dominoes fell after that one, a lot.
Yeah. We have this fascinating rule in UK legislation that the officials choose the name of the bill. So it's very neutral and just describes what it is, the communications data bill or whatever it might be. So you can't have a Patriot thing, which is clearly a good thing. Because clearly if you oppose the Patriot Act, you're not a patriot. And I think there's some interesting things about political campaigning there. David, over to you.
Just to say, I think the diversity thing is a great thing. Literacy, like media literacy, I'm not so like optimistic about it. And the reason is because it's just really hard. And just having to be kind of that switched on all the time, you sort of, it's just part of our lives, these adverts at the side of the screen or using WhatsApp or, whatever it is, using our phones, and having to be switched on all the time about, well, is that really true? Should I believe that? It's just really hard to do. So, I think it's something that can't harm, but it's also, I don't think, going to solve the problem. In terms of legislation, what I would like is social media companies to have to take responsibility for paid adverts. So I fully, I have a lot of sympathy with companies who, who are trying to deal with the, billions of messages and things that they've got every day that users are posting, and trying to police those and make sure that people are not saying things that they shouldn't do is incredibly hard. But I think paid adverts, so the adverts, the messages where social media companies are being paid to put those up, I think they should have to take responsibility for those, not just pass that on to, the advertiser who actually created that message.
So maybe we can now move away from governance issues, or they may stray back to look at sort of our typical lives. And perhaps I can start off with a question from Luke Rolls. Given all the technological change that we've had, I guess, pre-COVID and during COVID, what implications are after the way we educate young children? We've talked media literacy. What else is there that's worth raising? And you don't all have to speak on every single question, so chip in if you have thoughts and comments. Who wants to start us off?
I'll start, since I'm in the Faculty of Education. So I have some thoughts on this. In terms of, yeah, like I would also add to that the kind of like what was the, sorry, I lost the question here.
How we should change education for.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I mean, what also goes with that is like, you know, I have mixed thoughts on kind of like the media literacy within classrooms and these sort of things. It's mostly a good thing, I think. The other part of it that is often overlooked, and again, you might remember some articles from this from last year too, is that like the role of parents is a big one too. I can say from firsthand being in the classroom side of things, and I was like, we get the kids for the students for this number of hours. The parents are with them this amount of time. So, you know, as a teacher in the classroom, we can say like, you know, do this, do that. But when mom and dad are at home and kind of like also like, you know, modeling the kind of behavior, like that is much less of a thing. I was like, I'm not aware of parental media literacy things that they can then pass on. Well, I take that back. There's good organizations like Common Sense Media and some of these other places that do a really good job, I think, kind of shaping these things. But I feel like that's a big part of it. I was like, yes to like, you know, education, building in some of these digital literacy sort of things, but realizing that the other half, the majority of hours that in family life is kind of the big one too. So there's a little bit of parental cooperation education part that also needs to be a part of it, kind of a big part of it. Those are my first thoughts on that.
Anyone else want to pick up on education in general? You know, does it change how we should be teaching? Stunned silence. Maybe we'll come back to it if anybody thinks it later. Then let's think perhaps a bit about the last 6 months. So we've seen a couple of questions about that. So one from Neil Winkup saying, the effects of the last 6 months seem to be different across the demographics, boomers, millennials, Gen X and Z. How has this changed in social media use or adoption? So what have we seen in social media over the last 6 months? But we can also throw in the other question from Neil about some people getting very positive outcomes and others having poor and negative outcomes. What do we know that about how people use social media that it means that some people get sort of greater resilience and others don't? I know you're our social media expert. Do you want to?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, I guess kind of the channels that I know best about are our university's channels, and I'm not sure that's sort of best example to use to try and get a cross-cutting view across society. We have seen our sort of social media use at quite a steady level. So we haven't really seen much of a change in terms of demographic, you know, whether gender, age groups. It is sort of pretty much the standard that we have, which is between 20 and 45, you know, more men on Twitter, that sort of thing. But if you look at statistics, I guess there are certain things like, I mean, Dex already talked about our Netflix watching habits. So that has definitely grown. You know, people are spending more time watching films online. And I think that goes across the age groups from what I've read. And particularly the older people, you know, who might have been more watching TV have sort of started taking up these on-demand video services. In terms of other social media use, I haven't really seen much sort of reports or stats coming out yet.
I'll just say from my personal experience, so a couple of days ago, my mum told me that she watched her first online presentation over Zoom, and she was learning how to do that. So I suspect there's a wider point around people who wouldn't normally be able to attend an event like this. Probably, you know, for a large extent based on where they live. So people in rural areas, I suspect, are having more, you know, ability to engage with this kind of thing than they would have otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, geography is a fascinatingly different online, and there's been some interesting work on whether this move to technology makes older people more lonely because they're more disconnected from it, or less lonely because they can more easily reach out without having to travel. Dex, Tyler, do you want to? Dex?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think generally folks who are going to be the winners in social media and have better outcomes are folks who are the winners in real life and have been given access to better opportunities and resources probably than others. The question like, why are there different outcomes for folks? I mean, that's like, why are there different outcomes in society generally? And we know there's an incredibly unequal distribution of resources and opportunities, and having access to technology can mitigate that in some ways. It can give us access to new opportunities, but it ultimately on its own isn't going to be some silver bullet, which deals with structural inequalities in our society. And this is exactly, going back to the point, I made when we opened, if we look for a simple technologically focused solution to these things, is there some algorithmic tweak? Is there some new set of tools that will allow us to change, that, level of, winners, in social media? That's probably not going to work. Like, we're going to need much, much broader, holistic solutions, which attack those social and economic problems in our society. Like, actually, in terms of, education, I actually do share a lot of the concerns around media literacy and digital literacy on its own when it is marketed as digital media literacy. I think the actual real key is just have better education all around. Like, frankly, when governments and societies have been underinvesting in public education for decades, and then they give access to a massive population to tools that allow you unlimited information from a whole bunch of sources of very varying and often disreputable levels of quality, and then they bemoan the fact that people are suddenly sharing fake news, you have to throw up your hands and say, where were you when we were calling for more investment in education for decades?
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. And, obviously an educational establishment like this one, we're very keen on more there. Tyler, there's also, just to add a question specifically for you about morning habits. A lot of people got into the habit of using phones to check news, take pulse on Twitter when they wake up, and COVID made it worse. What are your top tips on how to switch to a non-tech start of the day? So if you can add that into your answer, that would be great.
Okay. All right. Let me try the first part first, because I would say it was an interesting question about kind of like, there's both positive and negative, which is very realistic, and that's our lived reality right now, is that there is good and bad. The part of what I still think is kind of really positive as a net positive in social media is kind of that serendipity. The fact that we get exposed to different people and different viewpoints and different things that we just never, ever would have done just in terms of everyday life. There is something kind of wonderful about that. The question about like positive and negative kind of outcomes depending on this, part of it I think is like social media, for better or for worse, kind of magnifies some aspects of our personalities, all of our personalities. There's a lot of people, I think we've talked a little bit about kind of like the downward social comparison thing. It's like, it's the keeping up with the Joneses phenomenon. I was like, oh, look at that person with that nice car and that nice house and that nice vacation and all of these things. Just even kind of being aware of like, like this is where I like the reflective part. This is the philosopher part of me coming out in terms of like really thinking in terms of like, what is our sense of self that social media kind of feeds into a little bit. It's going to be different for everyone else. Like, for me, like, I know this is me opening up to a bunch of strangers now in terms of like, I'm very competitive in terms of my personality, not in like everything, but seeing in terms of, it's kind of like, oh, this person got a book deal on that. Good for them. But also I want one of those. This person has 2 dogs. I have 0 dogs. That kind of like, sort of like, why can't I, do some of that too? And I was like, yeah, I'm very aware of that, very conscious of that. And I try to at least like keep that in mind sometimes. Easier said than done, I know, but like, take opportunities like this to reflect upon these kind of things. And the other question about kind of like early morning habits and things, so part of my research is also on digital and print reading. So like I do a lot of research with like how people read books. Everyone talks about the tactile experience of like feeling the newspaper, turning the pages, and all of that. And I think what I would suggest is, the simple solution is kind of like, switch to print. I still, Economist, we do a print subscription for that. And I was like, I kind of like that. the boundedness of, rather than like the rabbit hole of different links. And I was like, read this article, and then like, you know, here's 3 other ones. And I was like, oh, I like, well, once I read the sections I read, I'm done. And that's kind of nice. It makes me less reactive, I guess, in terms of like all the incoming things. On a more practical level, I just like sharing this tip because I think it's cool. For anyone that does subscribes to Spotify, I think Headspace is bundled into that cost now. So I think you get free Headspace for a year. It's free for students too. I think everywhere. I'm a big fan of that. That actually changed my life for the better. They have different voices now, so it's not just Andy and the Australian accent and all of these things. There's a diverse amount of content. It's a good way to kind of like slowly start your day. You know, everyone's mileage is going to vary on these sort of things, but I like that. I like picking a finite task, reading 1 article in the morning while drinking coffee, or I'm going to meditate for a couple of minutes and do these sort of things. To me, that's made a huge difference, huge positive difference in my life. So yeah, just some thoughts.
Fantastic. And then can I move us on now to think about the world of work a bit? So we've all seen a whole change in how we work, what work means. And so there are 2 questions, and I think the panel can read the full length of both questions from Sam Rothwell and Nicola Deboo, so I will slightly paraphrase them. But one question which I thought was quite interesting from Sam was talking about gaming and Dexter's experiences there. Are companies changing to being a bit more like online clans and guilds? So Sam says that I remember saying what prepared me to run meetings was raiding in World of Warcraft. I don't know what that says about how your meetings run, Sam. You know, I don't think my meetings work quite like that. But actually, is there this sort of new networked connection like guilds and clans, which is actually a bit more like how companies will develop and evolve, with potentially very close relationships between people who've never met? So that's the first piece. And then Nicola also talks just more generally about how do we ensure that the best consequences of the tech lead translate into longer term society, so we get the benefits of working from home without any sort of negative consequences such as discrimination for all the reasons we've touched on. So just bear in mind those in particular. What do we think about work and how that's changing? Tyler, I think was unmuted first, but.
Oh no, sorry, I was. I'm still unmuted from the last.
And Dexter's eager, and we'll come back to the rest of you.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I would say I really want to join one of Sam's meetings. They sound awesome. Like I'm totally doing my meetings wrong. You know, I think there's still a lot of the conversation about work that is being driven by folks in industry at the senior levels who are never super comfortable with the direction that work was going with new innovations and technologies. And there's a lot of pining for us to get back to the way things were as quickly as possible. And I'm not actually sure that the vast majority of people necessarily share some of those views. There's a lot of things about the way work was before which didn't really make a lot of sense. And we're actually on the way out for sure in the next 10 to 15 years. What we've seen, which has been extraordinary, is 10 to 15 years worth of advancement squished into 6 months. And, you know, now we are operating in a world which could be described as guilds and clans of online gaming. You know, you have, you know, entirely virtual organizations operating out there, which don't meet in person, which don't hold any physical events, which don't have any of the, you know, physical, context for decision-making and collaboration. And some of it's been bad. You know, some of it, you know, you wish, hey, I actually wish I could actually just sit around a table and hash this out rather than trading a bunch of emails or, you know, having to turn on my camera or, you know, send a bunch of WhatsApps. But like, actually, in a lot of other ways, it gets rid of the detritus, you know, that comes with being a physical organization. How much time do you waste, you know, in organizations, you know, having to sidle up to the thing you actually want to do because you've got to have a meeting? You know, the worst thing in the world, if you're a person who has a lot of meetings, is somebody throwing an extra 15 minutes or 30 minutes usually on your calendar for a quick chat. No, I'd actually rather not have a 30-minute meeting. I'd rather have a one-line email, thank you very much. And that's all right. We don't need to sidle up to the things that we really want to talk about. So I do think, you know, it's going to take time to really figure out what are the long-term pros and cons of this new way of operating. But I do think instinctively, I feel a lot of the changes that have made are actually very, very positive. And we shouldn't just have a knee-jerk reaction and think, oh, we should get back to the way things used to be. Like, actually, there's a reason, by the way, that the UK had the lowest productivity in Europe before COVID. And, you know, I think that way of work wasn't really working.
So now, any of the three of you can pick it up, but of course, you know, you all have the same employer, so you should be careful what you say about how your employer operated beforehand.
I will add that I really like Nicola's comment and like a question about some of these things. And I'm sort of going to answer with another question, but I did want to add that some things are a net positive in terms of, yeah, more opportunity. Things feel flatter in a way that they haven't in a long time. For people having worked in the tech industry too, and I know a lot of people know what I'm talking about, like meetings on meetings, and then the meeting, which is the one where you talk about all the meetings you're gonna have. Oh, thank God. Like some things are just better now because we've really kind of prioritized and stripped some of these things down. The other thing I would add, which I was just talking about this with a friend the other day, was the question of like ingrained habits. So sort of like, think about physically the fact, I'm still talking about meetings here, but like there's no head of the table now. The fact that like, you know, maybe I'd be curious if there's studies on these sort of things, and curious what people have noticed too, that some people have suggested it feels like a more level playing field in some ways in terms of like, you know, are women more able to like, you know, be able to speak up and not get talked over as much, just as one example, and these sort of things. So I'm curious what people think in the comments or questions about that. Like, what is your experience in the workplace now? What have you noticed changing that you kind of wish would stay in the long term? So my short answer is less meetings and more level playing field.
So of course, the new thing is the mute button, so you can actually silence people and stop them from speaking. But I won't silence them. Over to you.
One of the things that I'm quite interested in is this whole appearance of instant messaging now in the world of work. So, you know, as we are in Zoom meetings, people are chatting. Sometimes we actually encourage that. And I think there's pros and cons, you know, for some people who might not speak up, actually having the chat or having the instant messaging is definitely lowering the threshold of taking part. And they're sharing more information than they might otherwise. But on the flip side of it, there are those people who just, you know, they don't like the constant pinging, and actually we're losing them from those chats because they just feel like, you know, it's too much text-based instant information. Maybe, you know, most of it is not relevant to their specific role. So then they might just glaze over all of it. The other theme is around setting boundaries. So for example, in my team, we initially were using WhatsApp to share those work conversations. But you know, some of the people in the team don't have a work phone, which means that they are getting work messages on their private WhatsApp outside of working hours, which is quite stressful. So we had to set really clear boundaries. What are the channels that we use? What are the times that we work? And how do we go about that? And how do we kind of quickly flag what that instant message is about? Should we use almost like, you know, specific words at the start of it to flag what is the topic of this message? Because by nature, instant messaging is quite informal and not really thought out.
David.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on Tyler's point about the kind of flat organization, you know, because of technology. You know, on the one hand, I see where it comes from. Like everyone's Zoom box is the same size here. On the other hand, you know, as Sarah says in the chat, just because you're not the head of the table, it doesn't mean everyone in the chat doesn't kind of know that you're the important person or whatever. You know, humans are so sort of status hierarchy that we kind of ingrain this stuff anyway. On the other hand, like, you know, picking up on the World of Warcraft point, right? So, you know, I've been a nerd for a long time, and I played games, you know, 15 years ago. And interestingly, I still have friends from those games, right? And I've only met them in person once or twice in my life, but they're still friendships I've had for, you know, 15 years. So I think definitely you can build, you know, real relationships over technology. And again, sort of coming negative, I think what misses out is those kind of informal conversations that you don't really get when you have to schedule every meeting. So the business school at Cambridge, for example, it has very few meeting rooms, and it kind of has these spaces with tables in, and you sit around the table, but people are walking past all the time. So you kind of have these chance meetings, and we don't really have these chance meetings anymore because it's all scheduled so much. So if you think of the Zoom room, you're either invited to the Zoom or you're not. And previously, if you wasn't invited to the big meeting, you could kind of hear about it because you'd sort of hear about it in the corridor anyway. But now, if you're not invited, you know, you might not hear about what's going on. So it can perhaps make that hierarchy, you know, that status difference even worse if someone's not in the room.
We're beginning to run towards the end of the time that we have available. There's a couple of questions we haven't quite got round to, and if any of the panel want to address them, I think it's possible to type answers as well as say them, about getting the research communities to be part of oversight, about limiting micro-targeting to try to tackle echo chambers, about having more better public education we've sort of largely touched on, and maybe we should have an AI watchdog. We have them in finance, we have them in pharma, maybe we need something like that. So you can respond to those if you want to, but there's one final question from me, which I definitely want you each to pick up on, which is, what's your biggest hope and fear as to what will happen with our interaction in technology over the next 10 years? So a hope and a fear. What for you is the really important thing? I'm tempted to go in the reverse order that we started off with, which means, David, I'm afraid you get to go first.
Well, that's tough. In terms of who's on the oversight board, so I don't know who's involved now, to be honest. I thought sort of researchers and philosophers and things like that were on it already, but you know, Dex can obviously say. I wish the board well, but I've seen things sort of come and go. You know, at one time, Facebook had a rule that it could only change its sort of constitution if enough of a percentage of users voted for it. So, you know, there was this goal to sort of add democracy into the process. You know, people just didn't really get involved, and then it was sort of quietly shelved a couple of years later. So, you know, I hope, you know, and I think this will do some good, but I think there's sort of fundamental stuff underneath that needs to be dealt with. You know, there's sort of a key underlying issue that perhaps this oversight board might struggle to solve. In terms of hopes and fears, gosh, well, I mean, I hope this pandemic ends and technology ends up as a good sort of option, right? So we don't go back to the way it was, because, you know, I'm not really a fan of commuting every day. I don't think it's a great idea of flying all around the world, giving talks and things. So I hope technology becomes more of a kind of a good option and not just a last resort when there's a pandemic. What do I fear? I guess I'm fearing more sort of just people not understanding each other because we're all in our own little sort of echo chambers. I think for most people, technology actually makes the echo chamber better because you do hear those diverse viewpoints, but some people go down the rabbit hole and end up in very weird places. So that's what I'm worried about. It's a kind of too many weird places.
I think, Dex, you, in reverse order, you were next. What are your hopes and fears?
Yeah, totally. Just on the oversight board absolutely works with researchers and third-party organizations, and that's an important part of the process. So if any of you are interested in working with the oversight board, please do reach out. I'm always very happy to have a conversation. We have a team that is focused on that, and we'll actually be announcing more very soon about how organizations can reach out and get involved. My biggest hope and my biggest fear are both flip sides of the same coin. My biggest hope is that we have a healthier discourse about technology, and we actually get to have that discourse identify new solutions. I don't think we're anywhere near that right now. We've got into a mode where both the defenders and the critics of tech are talking past each other too much of the time. We have folks who want to make it out that tech is going to be the end of the world as we know it, and that this is the cause of all of society's great ills, or one of the primary causes. And then we have folks who want to deny everything and say tech is great, and everyone's just trying to blame us, because there's a power struggle going on between the old centers of power and the new centers of power in our economy. And I think both of those arguments are ridiculous. I think vast majority of folks working in the tech industry, and I think actually a good chunk of the changes that are produced in our lives are very, very positive. Of course, there are huge, huge problems, huge challenges, and the industry has been very bad at solving them. And governments and other leaders have also been very slow at reacting to them. The only way we dig ourselves out of this hole presented by Digital Century is by all of these sides working together to identify societal solutions. If we don't come up with societal solutions to these problems, we are not going to solve them. And then the tech really is going to be something that becomes the nightmare scenario for all of us. So that's my biggest hope and fear. I'm 50-50 on whether we're actually going to get there.
Tyler.
I'll start with the fear, I guess, in terms of, and it's similar to David's, in terms of, so my background is also in rhetoric. Rhetoric is basically, discourse and kind of like how we communicate, with each other. And it's hard not to notice that in the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years, several years, it's become so much more polarized and so much more like ad hominem, kind of like, about the person. Like, what happened to, like, oh, I don't agree with what David said about this. That's how, it might have been not too long ago. And all of a sudden it's like, I don't agree with what David said and I hate him now. That worries me a lot in terms of like, it's really hard to have conversations when like the polarization and the knee-jerk reactionness of that, like how do we do that? Like, we're just talking across each other than talking to each other. I worry about that. And that kind of touches on what Dex is saying too, in terms of like, yeah, we need to actually be able to talk in a way that, like, is actually positive and meaningful. I worry about that. I worry about that a lot in terms of it's happening. It has been happening. It's happening now, and that it keeps happening. But on the flip side, to turn it on a more positive note, so you already know I'm a competitive person and don't like meetings, but I'm still an optimistic person at heart. So like, I feel like things will get better. I feel like that, like, knowing the history of tech panics, and we talked about this a little bit with railroads and, newspapers, paperback novels at one point were supposed to be really bad for us and cause, like us to get the vapors and everything else and fill our heads with things. But we figured it out. And I feel like, what's different now, without question, is the rapidity of this and the exponential growth in terms of, computing power and data and all these things has just gone like this, in terms of that is so much faster than any other kind of like technological change we've had. I think we will figure it out. It'll take a while. We've got work to do and we've got to do it together, but I think someday we'll get there. That's my hope.
So finally, Anu.
Yes, I guess my fear is that if I look back at the 10 years in social media, so looking into the past and how it's been quite exciting, lots of new platforms emerging, disruption in that sense. My fear is that for the next 10 years, it's going to become quite stable, that it's going to be hard for new companies, startups to come up and challenge the established players, and that everything will become very centralized. I think that's my biggest fear. In terms of hope, I'm really hopeful that more people will have access to the internet and to all the opportunities there, and that as a result, we will start to see more representation, just coming back to the point about diversity that Dex was talking about. I mean, that is my biggest hope.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I mean, my biggest hope is that we can continue to have conversations like these, whether they are technologically enabled or in person for real. So thank you very much to all of the panel, to Anu, to Dex, to Tyler, to David. Thank you so very much for Sarah and Georgia, who've been helping so much behind the scenes to make sure this works smoothly. And as I say, we hope to see you at other events for the Intellectual Forum, either online this term or in the future when things get back to normal for real in that wonderful hall that Tyler was speaking about. But thank you very much for joining us. Have a very good rest of your evening and weekend. Bye.